Welcome to this Management Series module on making strategic borrowing decisions. This is one in a series of educational tutorials that have been created for you by the law school at the University of San Francisco to help you get on target to succeed financially while you're in school. And in this module, we're going to focus on understanding what it means to be borrowing money in law school and how to make good choices about how you're borrowing money while you're here. Because you have choices and you have options, you want to make sure you're making the best decisions possible. And to begin, we need to realize that the majority of law students today, over 90% of all law students around the country, are borrowing money to help pay for their legal education. And so the majority of law students today are now graduating with an educational mortgage. They are essentially financing this important investment in themselves with money that in the same way they might take out a mortgage to buy a house, because they want to make the investment, they want to be able to get the skills necessarily to do what they're passionate about doing in some area of the law, but they haven't saved up enough money to pay for it themselves. And you're likely in that group. And you can be successful in repaying this mortgage without having to sacrifice your career aspirations or the achievement of your other personal and financial goals, but you must make smart, strategic, and well-informed decisions about how you finance your legal education. So what are the decisions you have to make while you're here at the law school? Well, you have to ask yourself the following questions. Should you borrow private student loans rather than federal student loans if you could get a lower interest rate? You might think that that would be a good idea, that it would save you money, but it might not be the right decision. But what information do you need in order to make that choice? Should you pay the interest on your loans as it accrues while in school? Interest will be accruing on the loans you're borrowing while in school, and the government, as your lender, will actually be encouraging you to pay that interest if you could. But the question becomes, would that really be in your best interest financially? And what information you need in order to make that decision? And finally, should you borrow the minimum amount you need to achieve your goals? Clearly, this is important, but you need to make sure you're correctly assessing what your goals are. So in order to make the decisions that we're asking you to make here, you need to understand how federal student loans, the loans you are likely borrowing, differ from other forms of debt, including private student loans, so that you can make informed decisions when answering and addressing these questions. To do that, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the reality that if you're in law school and you're like more than 90% of law students today, you are borrowing money and incurring debt to be here. And normally with debt, you're boxed into a corner from a financial perspective. Another way to say it is you're digging yourself into a hole. Why are you in that corner? Why are you in that hole? It's because payments are based on the amount you owe, your debt, not on your ability to repay that debt. And your monthly payment is equal to the amount required to pay off all the debt plus accrued interest in a given period of time. And you must make that payment each and every month, whether you can afford it or not. So that really has put you in a predicament. It's boxed you in. It's dug you into that hole. And in reality, it's really put you at risk. And it's limiting your options financially. Debt has a way of doing that. And in other words, it boxes you into a corner. Because debt normally puts you at risk of having to miss a payment, for example, due to a loss of income or an unexpected expense. Because if your monthly payment's based upon how much you owe and it's inflexible, which normally with debt, that is the case, then if you have a change in your circumstances, such as a loss of income or an unexpected expense that now would prevent you from making that payment by the due date, then you'll have to miss the payment, and that will damage your credit and create additional negative financial consequences for you, an outcome that you really want to avoid. Debt also impacts your ability to make other choices financially. For example, it might prevent you from being able to change jobs or take some time off from a job if you needed to. It certainly would be impacting your ability to be investing for retirement and buying a house, because the more you owe, the more you must pay each month on that debt, leaving less money available for other purposes. So clearly, there is a reason to be concerned about having debt, and that is the concern that it's putting you at risk and it's limiting your options. But you need to understand that not all debt is the same. So what's the difference? Well, in my opinion, as an economist and as a student loan expert, I think you can characterize debt as being in one of three types. And what I've created here is, in essence, what I call the traffic light of debt. You have red light debt. That's debt you never want to have. You want to avoid it, and that would be credit card debt. Credit card debt is the most expensive form of debt. When you're using your credit card, you're really not making an investment. And when you have credit card debt, that debt is lowering your credit score. So it's impacting your ability to borrow money for other purposes and what it would cost you to do so. And for more information about credit scores, if you're not familiar with credit scores, I'd encourage you to check out one of the other modules in the Money Management Strategy series on how to build good credit, because we go into a lot of discussion in that module about credit scoring. So I encourage you to check that out. Credit card debt doesn't dig you into a hole or box you in financially. It really causes you to have jumped into financial quicksand. So you really want to avoid credit card debt at all costs. Then there's cautionary debt. Debt with a yellow light. That would be the mortgage for your home. That would be a private student loan. It's debt you're incurring to make an investment, but it comes with risk because the monthly payments, once you're repaying the debt, are inflexible. They're based upon how much you owe. They're not taking into account what you can afford to be paying. So it's put you in harm's way. And it potentially is limiting your ability to do other things financially. So you want to be very cautious about borrowing that money. Then finally, there's the green light debt, federal student loans. Now, assigning a green light doesn't mean you should borrow all that you can and charge full steam ahead, but rather, in borrowing this money, you are making an investment, but it has very little risk. And that's because with federal student loans, you don't need to be boxed into that corner. You don't need to feel as though you've dug yourself into a hole financially. And why is that? It's because, in essence, with federal student loans, you're offered the opportunity during repayment of choice, flexibility, and safety, something that you normally wouldn't have when you have borrowed money. So how are federal student loans different? Well, the most important way in which federal student loans are different from all other forms of credit is that with your federal student loans, your payments can be based on your income rather than on the amount of your debt. With federal student loans, given the payment plans that exist today, your payments can be equal to less than 10% of your household's monthly adjusted gross income. And that means you could have more than 90% of your income for everything else, regardless of the amount of your debt. So it can be the income from your job that's determining your monthly payment, not the amount of money you had to borrow to be able to get that job. And so if you do have a loss of income, you could get your monthly payment reduced. And if having more than 90% of the income from whatever job you want will give you enough resources to cover all your other expenses, then your federal student loan debt should not be the reason you can't afford to take whatever job you want. It also shouldn't be the reason that in a general way, you can't afford to be saving for retirement, saving for the money you need for the down payment to buy a home, given what your income otherwise would have allowed you to do. So it really provides you with a financial safety net because of the income-driven repayment structure that is uniquely available to federal student loans, that is really protecting you against the possibility of having to miss payments in a way that you wouldn't have that safety net with a private student loan or other forms of debt. And if you think about it, it is even providing you with a safety net that you don't have with your living expenses. Because let's suppose the extreme situation is the case. You have no income. Well, 10% of zero is zero. So that means your scheduled payment on your federal student loans could be zero. Yes, interest would be accruing, so the cost of the debt would be growing, but at least you wouldn't be experiencing or suffering the negative consequences of having to miss a payment. But if you had no income, how would you be paying your living expenses? So even your living expenses create more financial risk to you than do federal student loans. And yet you would never characterize debt as being less risky to you financially than your living expenses. But because of the income-driven repayment structure that's available to you with federal student loans, that is in fact the case. Another feature of federal student loans that's important is that negative amortization is allowed. In other words, your monthly payment can be less than the interest that accrues that month on that loan, thereby providing more flexibility and safety in repayment. And this is not allowed with any other form of consumer debt, including private student loans. So as such, federal student loans need not box you into a corner financially. You have options, but more importantly, you really have a built-in financial safety net that you wouldn't have with other forms of debt. And that's important to understand if you're going to make informed decisions, particularly about who you're borrowing the money from. But federal student loans also provide payment relief options if you need to postpone repayment when experiencing financial hardship, perhaps due to an unexpected expense, because you could postpone repayment with either a deferment or a forbearance, and that would not negatively affect your credit to doing so. And for more information about payment relief options and in general about how to manage repayment of student loans, I'd encourage you to check out the Loan Repayment Strategies series of educational tutorials that also are available to you through the Financial Aid Office here at the law school at the University of San Francisco. But with federal student loans, you also may get a portion of the debt forgiven if it goes unpaid. And there are two ways this could occur. With the income-driven repayment plans, if there's a balance remaining after 20 to 25 years of being on a qualifying income-driven repayment plan, such as revised pay-as-you-earn or pay-as-you-earn or the income-based or IBR plans, then the remaining balance would be forgiven, but you'd have to pay taxes on it based upon the current tax code. Now, alternatively, there's public service loan forgiveness. There, the balance on your direct loans would be forgiven after 120 months of qualifying public service. But you want to be aware of the risks associated with having debt forgiven. Because first of all, these are benefits or features of the loans that could change due to changes in federal law. Congress could decide to eliminate these features or change them in some way. So again, I'd encourage you to learn more about loan forgiveness, but in particular on public service loan forgiveness, check out the module in the Loan Repayment Strategy series on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program to learn more about that program. The key is that what really differentiates federal student loans structurally from all other forms of debt, what gives it that green light, is the income-driven repayment structure, the opportunity that your payments could be based on what you can afford to be paying each month, rather than on the amounts you owe, thereby giving you really the ability to account for your ability to repaying the debt as you're having to pay it back, so that you're insured, hopefully, of always having an affordable required or minimum monthly payment. And remember, you can always voluntarily pay extra. So I think it is important to understand that from a risk perspective, your federal student loans provide you with a safety net that you normally wouldn't have. And risk is certainly a factor that normally is of concern when borrowing money. Here, it's greatly minimized or reduced relative to all other forms of debt. But there's also the other concern about debt, the cost of the debt. And making an informed decision about how you are borrowing money and how you're managing your borrowing requires that you understand the costs of that decision. In reality, debt always has two costs. There's the direct cost, the interest and fees you're paying for the right to have borrowed someone else's money. And you certainly want to minimize that to the extent you can. But there's also the opportunity cost, the value of what you are foregoing each month as you're repaying the debt. In essence, the interest you are losing. Because as you're paying back debt each month, whatever amount you're paying, you're foregoing the opportunity of being able to use that money for other purposes. And yet you could have invested that money in your retirement plan where you would have been earning interest. So to the extent that cost is motivating your decision, for example, your desire to perhaps get the lowest cost debt, if you're focusing only on the direct cost, the interest rate you're being paid, that you're paying to borrow that money, then you're not correctly understanding what the cost of the debt is, because you're ignoring the opportunity cost. You're ignoring the value of what you'd be foregoing as you're paying the debt back. And if to get a private loan, for example, to get a lower interest rate, you have to pay off the debt more quickly, then you're going to be diverting more of your income to the repayment of that debt than you would have had to under the corresponding federal loans. And that is therefore going to increase the opportunity cost, because it's going to require you to divert more of your income than you would have had to the repayment of the debt and away from the opportunity, for example, to be earning interest. And if you're not considering that trade-off when it comes to the cost of the debt and its role in your decision-making, you're not making an informed decision. Because opportunity cost is all about trade-offs. It's understanding that we have alternatives when you use your scarce resources, both time and money. So you want to be asking yourself, am I putting my time and my money to its highest and best use? Because if you are, then you're covering the full opportunity cost. If you're not, then you're not making the best use of the money. But there's another factor to consider when it comes to this interest issue and the cost. And that's the difference between simple and compounding interest. Simple interest is essentially interest that's increasing in a linear manner over time because it is not being capitalized. In other words, the interest is accruing, but it's not being added to the principal balance. And the interest generally accrues on your federal student loans as simple interest during repayment, and it's accruing as simple interest while you're in school. So although interest is accruing, it's not compounding. It's not at a regular time interval being added to the principal balance such that at that point it's now accruing interest. In contrast to that, we have compound interest. And this is interest that increases exponentially over time because it is being capitalized at regular time intervals. In other words, it's being added to the principal balance such that now that interest is also now accruing interest. And this could be happening on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis, a weekly basis, or in the case of the stock market, it would be happening daily. And interest is compounding, perhaps as often as daily, on your investments. And so your money is growing exponentially. So this becomes important to understand because, in general, you want to recognize that if you are accruing interest and it's on debt, you want it to be accruing as simple interest. In other words, to be increasing in a linear fashion, which in the case of federal student loans is what's happening. If you are accruing interest on an investment, you want it to be compounding interest. You want it to be growing exponentially. So as such, you could end up with more money, not less, by investing your extra funds rather than paying off your federal student loans faster. But if you've borrowed private student loans, you may not have a choice to take a more reasoned or a slower approach to repayment. So you could, as I said, be losing the opportunity to be earning compound interest to the extent you could have done so with your federal student loans because you're having to divert more of your income to the repayment of those private student loans than you would have had to do so if instead you had borrowed federal student loans. So you want to make sure that you understand these cost factors as well, because with that information, along with the fact that with your federal student loan structurally, you have less risk, this will allow you to be able to make the decisions you make. So what should you do when mapping your course financially in law school? Should you borrow private loans? Well, you have the right to do so. And if you're an international student, that's the only option you're going to have. But if you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident and therefore are eligible to borrow federal loans, then borrowing private loans will cause you to lose the choice, flexibility, and safety provided by federal student loans, including the income-driven repayment options. And you may lower the direct cost because you may have gotten a lower interest rate on the private student loan, but you will increase the opportunity cost because you likely will have to repay the private loan faster and therefore have a higher monthly payment to qualify for the lower interest rate. And so, as such, you may be giving up more financially than you are gaining if you borrow a private loan. And you certainly are taking on more risk. So you want to exercise caution, be fully informed, investigate all of the differences between private student loans and federal student loans before you make this decision. Don't focus solely on the interest rate. In general, if you are eligible for federal student loans, they are going to provide the lowest risk, and likely, when you consider both the direct and the opportunity cost, the lowest cost options as well, at least given the current interest rates on federal student loans and current expected rates of return long-term on the stock market. So again, you just want to make sure you're well informed. The next issue was, should you be paying the interest as it's accruing while you're in school? Well, the interest on unsubsidized federal loans, the loans you're borrowing while in law school, accrues as simple interest while you're in school. It is not compounding while you're in school. It is not getting capitalized. It is not accruing interest itself while you're in school. That interest that accrues while you're in school will capitalize. In other words, it will be added to the principal balance only when the loans enter or re-enter repayment. So it's not happening on a regular basis. Therefore, it is better if you have the means to be paying anything on your loans to reduce the amount you are paying, reduce the amount you are borrowing, rather than to be paying the interest, accruing interest, if you have the funds to pay that interest while in school. You'll get more bang for your buck. And did you know that you can return unused loan funds? If you return loan funds that you don't need within the first 120 days of the disbursement, and by the way, you get a disbursement of loan funds at the beginning of every semester, the total amount owed will be reduced. In other words, the principal balance will be reduced by the amount you've returned, and any interest and fees that were charged on that loan amount returned will be reversed or credited back. so it will be as if you never borrowed that amount before. Well, that's going to save you more money than if you just paid some of the interest. So if you find at any time during the period of time you're in law school that you have extra money that you don't feel you're going to need until you expect to get your first paycheck, and you're still within the first 120 days of a disbursement of a loan, contact the law school financial aid office for more information about how you can return that unused portion. That would provide you with more bang for your buck than paying some of the interest. Now finally, should you borrow the minimum amount possible? Well, yes, but borrow only what you need to achieve your goals, but make sure you're differentiating between what you need and what you want, and understand what financial aid is intended to cover. Will it be enough to achieve your ultimate goal? Consider all the costs you'll incur to achieve your goals, including how are you going to pay your living expenses during the non-enrollment periods, for example, the summer months when you're not taking classes. Because although you've gotten financial aid to cover your living expenses during the academic year, the school cannot give you financial aid for those summer months in which you're not enrolled in classes. You also are going to have to pay for your bar exam expenses and your living expenses while you're preparing for and taking the bar exam and waiting for your bar results. And how will you pay for that? To the extent you're needing to borrow money to cover these expenses, it would be better to be borrowing the green light debt, federal student loans, that aren't creating risk for you than to be living off of your credit cards, the red light debt, or having, for example, to borrow the private bar study loans that might be available to you after you graduate. Because you want to recognize that you really are facing a 39-month budget in law school. From the time you started law school until you achieve your ultimate goal of getting your first paycheck as an attorney, you have some other costs to consider. Bar results typically are not known until about 39 months after you begin law school, assuming you were enrolled full-time for 3 years. That is certainly true in California. Now, if you're a part-time student, it's an even longer period of time. But financial aid is only available for the 27 of those 39 months, the 9 months of each academic year if you're a full-time student. If you're a part-time student and you're going year-round, then you are getting financial aid for all 12 months of the year. So the question you have to ask yourself, particularly those of you who are full-time students, how will you pay for those other 12 months of expenses? Your living expenses, your bar prep costs, relocation if you have to move after you graduate to where you're going to be working. Because it would be best not to be using your credit cards or your private bar study loans. It'd be better if you have to be borrowing money to cover any of those expenses that you used the federal student loans that you're eligible for. Now, you can't borrow extra loans to cover these expenses, but you can use the loan funds that you are eligible for to cover them if you didn't need them to cover the expenses fully for the 9 months of the academic year. So for example, if you're living more cheaply than the school estimated when they calculated your cost of attendance, then you don't need all of the funds that you might have been eligible to borrow for your living expenses for those 9 months, but it doesn't mean you can't use those excess funds to cover living expenses during a portion of those other months, those other 12 months, for example. So as you're planning your budget and thinking about how much you need to be borrowing, don't be focusing only on the 9 months of the academic year or the 12 months of the academic year if you're a part-time student, but think about that longer horizon. How much are you going to need until you expect to get your first paycheck doing whatever it is you plan to do with this degree? And for those of you who are full-time students, that's really looking more at that 39-month budget strategically. So be strategic. Plan your borrowing wisely. Don't leave it to chance. So how did you decide on how much to borrow? Did you borrow the amount indicated on your financial aid award notice? Did you borrow the maximum amount possible as indicated on that financial aid award notice? Or did you estimate your budget or your spending plan and borrow only what you needed to fill the gap between your expenses and the other resources you have? Well, you need to understand that how much you're eligible to borrow was determined by the financial aid office based upon your cost of attendance or the sticker price. And cost of attendance is calculated by the financial aid staff, and it includes both the fixed educational costs that you're incurring, the tuition fees the university is charging you to be here, but also living expenses for the months of the year you're actually enrolled in classes. And your financial aid cannot exceed that cost of attendance. So the total amount of funding you're eligible to get through financial aid between both scholarships and grants and the loans you can borrow is based upon and cannot exceed that cost of attendance. But that cost of attendance is not intended to be prescriptive. It's not your budget. So you need to actually figure out what are your expenses, not only for the 9 months of the academic year, but also for that longer term horizon, that 39 months, and compare that to your resources. What resources will you have available? And then do the math. Take the resources, subtract from it your expenses, and then see what the balance is. If it's negative, then you have a gap to fill, and that's likely the amount you need to borrow. But remember, don't overlook the reality that you really have this longer term horizon to worry about. You're not just worrying about covering the expenses for the academic year. You really have to get to the point where you've covered your expenses until you expect to start getting that first paycheck. So again, make sure you're making a fully informed decision. And when it comes to managing your loans, start now. Take control and plan ahead. In managing your loans, you need to understand the loan terms. And when you borrowed the money, you had to do entrance counseling. Just before you graduate, you'll do exit counseling. And in both of those counseling programs, the loan terms were reviewed. You also can refer to the Loan Repayment Strategies series of educational tutorials that goes into those details in great detail. The key is don't ignore the mail from your loan servicers. The loan servicer is the company that's managing your loans for your lender. On the loans you're borrowing here at the law school, they are all direct loans, both the unsubsidized direct student loan and the direct Grad Plus loan. You're borrowing those loans directly from the federal government through the U.S. Department of Education. But the government currently does not service or manage the loans themselves. They contract with third parties to manage the loans on their behalf. That third party is referred to as a loan servicer. That's who should be communicating with you about these loans. And although while you're in school, as long as you're enrolled at least half time, you shouldn't have to be making any payments on the loans. You don't want to ignore the mail you're getting from these loan servicers because, again, unfortunately, sometimes they make a mistake and you want to make sure they haven't accidentally put your loans into repayment sooner than they should have. You want to make sure that you're promptly reporting changes in your address and so forth to your loan servicer. Another important step, establish online access to your account with your loan servicer at their website. Meet all your borrower responsibilities. Request deferments and forbearance to postpone repayment if needed once you graduate. And remember that you have to repay all that you owe and to do so on time so it doesn't damage your credit. I have a few final comments about making good strategic decisions about how you're borrowing money. You really want to have a smart strategy, and that requires keys to success. First of all, stay focused on your goals. Remember, you are here to get a degree that's going to ultimately allow you to do something with that degree. So your ultimate goal will not really be achieved until you've passed the bar exam and are now getting paid doing what it is you plan to do with the degree. So you want to avoid any unnecessary distractions. And worrying about money would be a distraction. So make sure you're making informed strategic decisions about how you're borrowing the money you need. Take control of your spending so that you borrow only what you need. There's a direct correlation between how much you need to borrow with how much you're spending. The more you spend, the more you're going to have to borrow. And one of the modules in the money management series is on how to save on spending. So I encourage you to check out that module as well. And you want to manage your loans responsibly because once you've borrowed the money, you want to make sure you're doing everything you need to be a responsible borrower. And why borrow the minimum? It's because when you borrow loans, you are spending your future income and you're always going to have other things you want to do with that money. So how can you reduce your borrowing while you're in school? Well, one way is to reduce your spending. So again, check out the module on saving on spending. But you also can increase your resources so that you depend less on borrowed money to cover your expenses. That means applying for additional grants and scholarships. And there are private organizations that may be willing to provide a scholarship to you. So be doing your research. Check with the financial aid office to see if they know of organizations such as state and local bar associations or organizations that are willing to provide scholarships because they're interested in the same area of law that you are interested in pursuing. Use cash, not credit or debit cards, because as you're spending money, you want to be mindful that you're not spending more than you need to. And if you're using cash rather than plastic, it gives you a better sense of being able to evaluate the trade-off. In spending that money, how much money will be left? And so can you really afford to be spending that money now? And you have other ideas. Think about it. Talk to your friends and colleagues to see if they've come up with ideas. And you have opportunities to learn more, particularly about how to be good about managing your money while in school. So check out all the money management modules, but also check out the loan repayment strategies modules as well, because they'll give you a lot of good information about how to manage the repayment of your federal student loans once you enter repayment after you graduate. And for more information, a good source is always going to be the financial aid office here at the law school. You also, if you have questions about your specific loans, should be contacting your loan servicer, the company that's actually managing those loans for your lender. But the Department of Education also has useful information online. For general information about federal student loans, check out studentaid.gov. For information about loan repayment, go to studentloans.gov. To see what your monthly payments might be under each of the available payment plans on your federal student loans, use the repayment estimator that's available out at studentloans.gov. And for more information about federal direct consolidation loans, that's where you would refinance one or more of your existing federal loans after you graduate because it might somehow benefit you. Check out studentloans.gov. To see your student loan history, you can do so at the National Student Loan Data System that's created by the Department of Education at nslds.ed.gov. And for more information about public service loan forgiveness, if you're planning a career in public service, working either with a government agency or a qualifying nonprofit, check out studentaid.gov/public service or call Fed Loan Servicing, the contractor that actually manages that particular program for the Department of Education. And you can reach them at 1-855-265-4038. Remember, you want to get on target financially, and you want to be strategic about how you're borrowing money while in school. Borrow only what you need to achieve your goals. Make smart, strategic, but most importantly, well-informed decisions about how you borrow money, how much you're borrowing, who you're borrowing from, and how you're managing those loans while you're in school. Because if you do that, you will borrow the right amount. And if you borrow the right amount, hopefully it will not prevent you from being able to pursue the career you want, as well as being able to achieve the other financial and personal goals that the income from your job otherwise would have allowed you to achieve. But that requires being strategic about your borrowing. So I hope this information has been helpful to you. Good luck to you as you pursue your career here at the University of San Francisco School of Law.